You'd think that returning to Earth after 2 years in space would be a triumphant moment, wouldn't you? It wasn't. Far from it. In fact, it was the beginning of something that, even now, sitting here and telling you this, I can barely believe happened. But it's true, every word. Let me start from the beginning. Our mission was called Horizon 8, the first crewed expedition to Europa. Yeah, that Europa, the icy moon of Jupiter. We were 6 astronauts, trained to the point of exhaustion for this momentous journey. Our departure was broadcast worldwide. Everyone watched us lift off with hope in their eyes, pride in their hearts, and a belief that humanity was finally stepping beyond the limits of Earth. The mission was grueling, as you'd expect. Months of traveling through the void of space, cramped quarters, endless maintenance routines. And then, the big payoff, Europa. The moon was as stunning as we'd imagined, with its endless sheets of ice reflecting Jupiter's distant glow. We drilled through its surface, probing for signs of microbial life, mapping uncharted terrain. For 2 years, we worked tirelessly, collecting data that would change how humanity saw the universe. And then it was time to come home. We'd been in constant contact with mission control throughout the journey. Regular updates, telemetry checks, even video calls with family. Earth felt distant, but never out of reach. At least until the last few weeks of our return trip. It started subtly. The signals from mission control grew delayed, garbled, then stopped altogether. At first, we blamed solar interference. Space can be temperamental like that. But as days turned into weeks and the silence from Earth stretched on, unease crept into our crew. By the time we re-entered Earth's atmosphere, we were a bundle of nerves. We reassured ourselves, of course. It's just a communication blackout, we said. The ground team will explain everything when we land. But when our spacecraft touched down, it was wrong. There was no one there. No recovery team, no ground crew, no reporters, no cameras, no cheering crowds. Just an empty airfield, silent as a grave. "Where the hell is everybody?" Commander Fields muttered, his voice breaking the oppressive stillness as we disembarked. We tried to stay calm, professional. We activated emergency protocols which involve radioing all known ground stations. Nothing. Not even static. It was as though every frequency had been wiped clean. Still, we clung to logic. Maybe there had been an evacuation, a natural disaster perhaps, or a global conflict. Whatever it was, there had to be a rational explanation. Didn't there? But the rational explanations began to crumble as we ventured further from the landing site. The base near the airfield was abandoned. Equipment sat where it had been left, as though people had simply walked away. Computers were still on, screens displaying outdated logs. Half-eaten meals sat on tables, covered in mold. It was eerie, like time had paused and left everything behind. Could it be a virus? Dr. Santos speculated, his voice tinged with growing dread. Something that forced mass quarantine? Then where are the bodies? Lieutenant Kim countered. Even in quarantine, there'd be some sign of life. She was right. There was no one. Not a soul, not a sound. Just the wind whispering through empty corridors. By the time we reached the nearest city, panic had set in. You'd think the sight of a major metropolis, silent and deserted, would be enough to break even the strongest spirit. And maybe it was. The streets were lined with cars, some parked neatly, others abandoned mid-turn. Buildings stood intact, their windows reflecting the sunlight. But there were no people, not a single one. "Hello!" Commander Fields shouted, his voice echoing off skyscrapers. "Can anyone hear us?" No response, just that deafening, all-encompassing silence. It wasn't just the absence of people that got to me. It was the stillness, the absence of birds, insects, even the distant hum of electricity. It was as though life itself had been drained from the world. Our training kept us moving, at least at first. We scoured the city for clues, anything to explain what had happened. Radios, phones, internet, all dead. Broadcast stations played static, if they played anything at all. Supermarkets and homes were fully stocked, untouched. It was as though the entire population of Earth had vanished overnight, leaving everything else intact. And then there were the clocks. I remember the first time I noticed it. A wall clock in a cafe, frozen at 3:07. At first I thought it was just broken, but then we started seeing more of them. Clocks on buildings and cars, on our phones, all stuck at the exact same time. "What happened at 3:07, Sanos whispered, staring at his wristwatch, which had also stopped ticking. We didn't have an answer, but the question hung over us like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing hour. Our next plan was to access government facilities. If there was any place that could offer answers, it would be there. But as we made our way to a nearby military base, we realized something else, something that chilled me to my core. The world wasn't just empty, it was wrong. Buildings that should have been familiar seemed slightly off. Colors muted, shapes distorted, like a dream you couldn't quite place. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though it resisted our every movement. And the sky. God, the sky. At first glance, it looked normal, blue with a few wispy clouds. But the longer you stared, the more you noticed the wrongness. The clouds didn't move. The sun didn't shift in the sky. It was as though the world had been frozen in a single moment, a snapshot of reality that refused to progress. "What is this?" Kim whispered, her voice trembling. Are we even on Earth?" It was a terrifying thought, one we didn't want to entertain. But as the days stretched on, and our search yielded nothing but more questions, it became harder to ignore. Wherever we were, it wasn't the Earth we'd left behind. You'd think we'd have fallen apart by now, wouldn't you? But no, we clung to each other, to the hope that there was some rational explanation waiting just around the corner. But that hope started to waver when the shadows appeared. It happened on our fourth night back. We'd holed up in an abandoned apartment complex, taking turns keeping watch. It was during Santos's shift that we first saw them. "Wake up," he hissed, shaking me awake. "Something's out there." At first I thought he was imagining things, but then I saw it too. A flicker of movement in the darkness beyond the window. A shape just barely visible, shifting and swirling like smoke. "What is that?" I whispered. No one had an answer. The shapes didn't come closer, not that night. They just hovered at the edges of our vision, watching, waiting. But for what? That was the first time I felt it, that deep, gnawing sense of being hunted. We didn't sleep much after that, and as the days turned into weeks, the shadows became bolder. They crept closer, lingering just out of reach, their forms more distinct. Not human, not animal, but something in between. "What do they want?" Kim asked one night, her voice barely audible. No one answered. We were explorers, scientists, trained to confront the unknown. But this was something beyond anything we'd ever prepared for. And the worst part? We weren't even sure we were still alive. Crazy, right? But that was just the beginning. The shadows became bolder. At first, they stayed outside, mere shapes against the periphery of our vision. But one night, they slipped inside. It started with a sound, barely audible, like the soft rasp of fabric brushing against itself. I was on watch, sitting near the broken window of the apartment where we'd barricaded ourselves for the night. The others were asleep, their breaths shallow and strained, as if even unconsciousness offered no peace. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, one of those same shifting, smoke-like figures we'd been seeing, sliding along the far wall of the room. It was moving against the light of my flashlight, defying all logic. My breath hitched as it rippled, stretching unnaturally, growing larger and darker with each passing second. "Wake up," I whispered, my voice barely steady. "Get up, now!" The others stirred groggily, but Santos was the first to notice the shadow. His face drained of color as he scrambled to his feet. "What the hell is it doing?" The shadow moved closer, its form expanding and contracting as if it were breathing. And then, for the first time, we heard it. A sound. Low, guttural, and so alien it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't a growl or a hiss, but something in between, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the air itself, resonating deep in our bones. "Move!" Fields barked, pulling us out of our paralysis. We bolted out of the room, down the stairwell, and into the street. Our flashlights swung wildly as we ran, the beams catching glimpses of the shadow as it followed us. It wasn't fast, but it didn't need to be. Its presence alone was enough to drive us forward, our fear propelling us into the unknown. When we finally stopped, panting and drenched in sweat, we realized we'd ended up in a park. The open space felt both freeing and terrifying. There were fewer places for the shadows to hide, but also nowhere for us to take cover if they appeared. "Did you hear it?" Kim asked, her voice shaking. "That sound. It felt like it was inside my head." "It wasn't just in your head," Santos muttered. He was clutching his flashlight so tightly his knuckles were white. "That thing, it's not just watching us anymore. It's testing us." "Testing us for what?" I asked. No one had an answer. We stayed in that park for the rest of the night, huddled together in a circle, our flashlights pointed outward. The shadows didn't follow us there, but the damage was already done. We were explorers, scientists, trained to confront the unknown. But this was something beyond anything we'd ever prepared for. The next day we reached the military base. You'd think that would have brought some relief, wouldn't you? A bastion of security, a place filled with answers. But when we arrived, we found more of the same. Empty halls, abandoned equipment, and that same eerie sense of time standing still. The base's command center was intact, though. Computers still hummed with power, their screens displaying static-laden menus. It took us hours to sort through the system, but eventually we uncovered a log, a series of fragmented entries from just before everything had stopped. Most of it was mundane: personnel rotations, supply updates, and weather reports. But then we found something that made our blood run cold. A single word repeated over and over in the final log entries: breach. "What kind of breach?" Santos muttered, scrolling through the fragmented data. "A security breach? A containment breach?" "It doesn't say," Fields replied, his jaw tight. "But whatever it was, it happened just before everything went quiet." And then there was the timestamp, 3:07, the exact moment all the clocks had stopped. We spent the next few hours combing through the base for more clues, but the deeper we went, the stranger things became. Rooms that should have been familiar seemed to shift, their layouts subtly altered. Hallways stretched longer than they should have, and doors appeared where none had been moments before. It wasn't just disorienting, it was impossible. And then we found the bodies. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The corridor we'd entered was lined with what looked like shadows. Dark, featureless shapes slumped against the walls and floor. But as we approached, the truth became horrifyingly clear. They weren't shadows. They were people. Or at least they had been. Their forms were distorted, their limbs twisted and stretched in ways that defied anatomy. Their faces were blurred, as if smeared like wet paint, and their skin was pitch black, absorbing the light from our flashlights. "Oh my God," Kim whispered, covering her mouth. What is this?" Sanus asked, his voice barely audible. We didn't have an answer, but the longer we stared, the more a sickening realization began to dawn on us. The shadows we'd been seeing outside, they weren't just creatures. They were what had become of the people. You'd think that would have broken us completely, wouldn't you? Seeing what might very well be our own fate staring back at us. And maybe it did in a way, but it also lit a fire under us. We needed answers. We needed to understand what had caused this breach, and we needed to figure out if there was a way to stop it. Our search led us deeper into the base, to a section labeled Restricted Access. The doors were heavy, reinforced, and they looked like they hadn't been opened in years. It took all of our combined strength to pry them open, and when we did, we were met with a wave of cold air that sent shivers down my spine. Inside, we found a lab, or what was left of one anyway. Equipment lay in ruins, scorch marks lined the walls, and the air was thick with the smell of burnt plastic and ozone. But in the center of the room, there was something intact. A large, circular device, its surface pulsing faintly with an otherworldly glow. "What the hell is that?" Kim asked, her voice trembling. "I think..." Santos hesitated, then took a step closer. "I think it's a portal." "A portal to where?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing against the device. The glow intensified, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something on the other side, a landscape that was dark, jagged, and impossibly alien. "We need to leave," Field said sharply, pulling Sanos back. "Whatever this thing is, it's not safe." But it was too late. The portal had been activated, and the low guttural sound we'd heard from the shadows began to fill the room. And then something stepped through. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was solid, massive, and utterly incomprehensible. Its form shifted constantly, like it couldn't decide what shape to take, and its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. We ran. I've never run like that in my life, and I hope I never have to again. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to move faster, to get away from the thing that had emerged from the portal. But no matter how fast we ran, the suffocating weight of its presence followed us, like it had seeped into the air itself. The hallways of the base twisted and stretched in ways that shouldn't have been possible. One moment, we were passing the same corridor we'd just come from. The next, the walls seemed to bend inward, narrowing as if trying to trap us. "What the hell is happening?" Sanos shouted, his voice echoing unnaturally. "No idea. Just keep moving," Fields barked, his tone sharp and commanding, though I could hear the edge of fear creeping in. Behind us, the creature's form shifted, pulsing and rippling like a liquid trying to take shape. It didn't move like it should have. No footsteps, no discernible limbs propelling it forward. Instead, it slid and folded through the air, its edges dissolving and reforming as if it were a glitch in reality itself. And the sound, that low guttural resonance, had grown into a cacophony of overlapping tones, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my skull and chest. It wasn't just noise. It was wrong on some fundamental level, like it didn't belong in our world. We burst through a heavy metal door and into an open hangar. The space stretched wide before us, scattered with abandoned vehicles and equipment. The exit was on the far side, a massive set of doors that, if we could open them, would lead us outside. Fields was the first to reach the control panel. "Cover me!" he shouted, slamming his fist against the panel and beginning to input commands. Kim and Santos stood guard, their flashlights darting toward every corner of the hangar, but the creature was nowhere to be seen. Not yet. I turned to check on Fields, but before I could say anything, the temperature in the room dropped. Instantly. The kind of cold that makes your breath crystallize in your lungs and your joints ache. "Where is it?" Kim whispered, her flashlight trembling in her hand. I looked around, straining my eyes, but the shadows in the hangar seemed thicker, darker than they should have been. And then, all at once, they started to move. "It's here!" I yelled. The creature emerged from the shadows like ink spilling across the floor, its form growing and shifting as it did. For the briefest of moments, it took on a shape. Something vaguely humanoid, with elongated limbs and too many eyes. But then it dissolved again, folding in on itself. Santos screamed and opened fire with the handgun he'd scavenged from the base earlier. The shots rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. But they passed through the creature without effect, as if it weren't really there. "Fields, hurry!" I shouted, backing away as the creature began to spread, its edges seeping across the floor like an oil slick. "I'm working on it," Fields snapped, sweat dripping down his face as he struggled with the controls. The sound grew louder, more intense, until it felt like my skull was about to split. The creature wasn't just watching us anymore. It was trying something, reaching into us, probing, like it wanted to understand us. Kim stumbled and fell to her knees, clutching her head. "I can't. It's in my mind. It's in my—" I grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "Don't give in. Stay with me." Finally, with a loud groan of metal, the hangar doors began to open, letting in a blast of light and cold air. "Go!" Fields shouted. We didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted toward the opening, the creature's presence pressing down on us with every step. For a moment, I thought we wouldn't make it, that it would swallow us whole before we reached the exit. But then we were outside, the blinding light of the sun hitting our faces, and the suffocating weight lifted. We collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, the harsh reality of the world around us settling in. The military base loomed behind us, silent once more. The shadows lingered at the edges of the open doors, but the creature didn't follow. It seemed bound to the base, or perhaps to the portal itself. "Is everyone okay?" Fields asked, his voice hoarse. Kim nodded weakly, still clutching her head. Santos didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the base, his expression unreadable. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know," Fields admitted, "but whatever it is, it's connected to that portal. And we need to stay as far away from it as possible." But that was easier said than done. We were alive, for now. But the experience had left us shaken, and the realization of what we'd seen brought no comfort. That thing wasn't just a random anomaly. It wasn't just another unknown to be studied or explained. It was a predator, and we were its prey. You'd think we'd have been relieved to be out in the open again, wouldn't you? But the world outside didn't feel any safer. The silence was still there, as oppressive as ever. The wrongness of the sky, the stillness of the clouds, the unchanging position of the sun was impossible to ignore. And then there were the shadows. They were everywhere. Not like the creature in the base, but more like its offspring. Smaller, more fragmented versions of the same incomprehensible presence. They lingered at the edges of our vision, flickering in and out of existence, watching us. We kept moving, heading toward the nearest city we could find on the maps we'd salvaged from the base. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. The days blurred together as we walked, each one more draining than the last. Food and water weren't an issue. We found plenty of supplies in the abandoned towns we passed through. But the psychological toll was crushing. Every night the shadows grew closer. We'd set up camp in whatever shelter we could find. A house, a gas station, even an old school. But it didn't matter. The shadows always found us. They'd gather outside, pressing against the windows and doors, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke caught in a windless void. And then they'd whisper. At first it was barely audible, a faint, indistinct murmur just beyond the edge of hearing. But over time the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't speaking in any language we recognized, but the tone was clear. Mocking, taunting, inviting. Santos was the first to crack. It happened on the 10th night. We were holed up in an old diner, the windows boarded up, the doors barricaded. The shadows had gathered again, their whispers filling the air like a poisonous fog. Santos stood up suddenly, his face pale and drenched in sweat. I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice shaking. "I can hear them. They're in my head. They're calling me." "Santos, don't," Fields said, stepping in front of him. "You're stronger than this. Don't let them win." But Santos wasn't listening. He shoved past Fields and began pulling at the barricades on the door. "Santos, stop!" I yelled, grabbing his arm. He turned to me, and the look in his eyes chilled me to the bone. They weren't his eyes anymore. They were empty, hollow, like the shadows had taken something from him. "They're not trying to hurt us," he said, his voice eerily calm. "They're trying to show us the truth." Before we could stop him, he wrenched the door open and stepped outside. The shadows surged forward, enveloping him completely. For a moment, we saw his silhouette, struggling against the writhing darkness. And then he was gone. The whispers stopped. We didn't sleep that night. Fields, Kim, and I sat in silence, too afraid to speak, too drained to cry. Santos was gone, and we had no way of knowing if he was dead or worse. But we couldn't stay there. The next morning, we packed our things and kept moving, the weight of his loss pressing down on us like a physical burden. You'd think we'd have hit our breaking point by now, wouldn't you? That we'd have given up, let the shadows take us too. But we didn't, because deep down, we knew the truth. Whatever had happened to the earth, whatever those shadows were, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. You'd think we'd be numb to the fear by now, wouldn't you? After all, fear can only gnaw at you for so long before it dulls into background noise. But with every step we took, every mile we put between ourselves and the military base, it became clearer. This wasn't the kind of fear you could ever get used to. We were trapped in a world that wasn't ours anymore. It became obvious when the sky shifted. Yeah, you heard me. The sky shifted. It started as a flicker, subtle at first. The sun, which had been frozen in the same position since we returned, blinked. For a split second, the light dimmed. The shadows stretched unnaturally, and the air grew heavy, like we were standing at the bottom of the ocean. Then it stopped, just as suddenly as it had started. "Did you see that?" Kim asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all nodded. No one wanted to say it out loud, but we were thinking the same thing. The sky wasn't just frozen, it was unstable. But that wasn't the worst of it. As we pressed on, the flickers became more frequent. Sometimes they were subtle, a brief distortion, like looking through heat waves. Other times they were violent. The ground would tremble, the air would ripple, and the world itself would feel fragile, like we were walking on the surface of a soap bubble, ready to pop at any moment. Crazy, right? But it gets worse. One evening, as the flickers grew stronger, we found ourselves in the heart of a small town. The kind of place you'd expect to find kids riding bikes, couples walking hand in hand, and dogs barking in backyards. Instead, it was silent. Of course it was silent. The buildings were intact, the cars still parked along the streets, but it all felt wrong. Too perfect, too preserved, like a diorama left behind in some forgotten museum. "Let's keep moving," Fields said, his tone sharp. "We don't want to be here when the flickers hit again." But then we heard it, a sound that stopped us dead in our tracks. A voice. "Help me!" It came from one of the houses, a faint, trembling voice, muffled by the walls but unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" Kim asked, her flashlight already trained on the nearest window. We all heard it. After weeks of nothing but the oppressive silence, the sound of another human voice was like a gunshot. "Help me," the voice repeated, this time louder. Without thinking, I moved toward the house. The others followed, their flashlights cutting through the dim light as we approached the door. It was ajar, swinging slightly in the still air. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. For a moment, there was no response. Then the voice came again. "Please, I'm in here." I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my boots. The air was thick, stale, and the shadows seemed to gather in the corners of the room, watching us. "Where are you?" Fields asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Upstairs," the voice replied. We exchanged uneasy glances, but curiosity, or maybe desperation, drove us forward. We climbed the staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. The voice led us to a bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was closed, but light seeped through the cracks around the edges, casting an eerie glow. Fields motioned for us to stay back as he opened the door. Inside, we found nothing. The room was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no windows, no source for the light that filled the space, just 4 blank walls and a bare wooden floor. But the voice was still there. "Thank you for coming," it said. We froze. The voice wasn't coming from a person. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the very air itself. What is this?" Kim whispered, backing toward the door. The light in the room began to shift, swirling and pulsing like liquid gold. And then it started to take shape. A figure emerged from the light, tall, featureless, and impossibly radiant. It wasn't human, not even close, but it was trying to be. Its form flickered and warped, like it was struggling to maintain a stable shape. "We've been waiting for you," the figure said, its voice a perfect mimicry of the one we'd heard earlier. "Who are you?" Fields demanded, his hand on the pistol holstered at his side. The figure tilted its head as if considering the question. "We are what remains, and you are the first to return." "To return from where?" I asked, my heart pounding. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out with one shimmering hand, and the air around us seemed to hum with energy. "You brought this with you," it said, its tone calm but accusing. "The breach, the collapse." "What do you mean?" Fields asked, his voice tight with anger and confusion. "We didn't cause this." The figure flickered, its form distorting. "Not directly, but your absence left a void, and the void invited others." The room trembled, the walls rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond. The figure's light grew brighter, almost blinding. "We cannot hold it back much longer," it said, its voice layered with an urgency that made my skin crawl. "You must choose." "Choose what?" I asked, shielding my eyes from the light. The figure's form began to unravel, the light spiraling outward. "To fix what has been broken, or to leave this world to the void. And just like that, it was gone. The room returned to darkness, the oppressive silence rushing back in like a tidal wave. None of us spoke for a long time. What could we say? We'd come looking for answers, but all we'd found were more questions and the faint, horrifying suggestion that maybe, just maybe, this was all somehow our fault. We left the house in a daze, the weight of the figure's words pressing down on us like a lead blanket. Fix what has been broken? What the hell did that even mean? And how were we supposed to do it? The flickers grew worse after that. The sky would twist and ripple every few hours, and the shadows became more aggressive, their whispers louder, more insistent. But it wasn't just the world that was changing. It was us. Kim was the first to notice it. One morning, as we were packing up to leave yet another abandoned town, she pulled me aside, her face pale. "Look," she said, holding out her hand. At first, I didn't see it. But then, as the light caught her skin, I realized what she was showing me. Her hand was fading, not like it was disappearing, but like it was becoming translucent, the edges blurring into the air around it. "I thought it was just a trick of the light," she said, her voice trembling. "But it's getting worse." Fields and I examined ourselves, and to our horror, we found the same thing happening. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, but it was there. We were becoming like them, the shadows. You'd think that would have been the final nail in the coffin, wouldn't you? That we'd have given up, let the void take us. But we didn't, because deep down we knew the truth. The breach wasn't just consuming the world, it was consuming us. And if we didn't find a way to stop it, there wouldn't be anything left, of Earth, of humanity, or of ourselves. So we kept moving. Toward what, we didn't know. But one thing was certain. The figure in the house was right. We had to fix what had been broken, whatever it took. But we had no idea what was waiting for us at the end of the road. And believe me, it was far worse than anything we'd seen so far. The shadows grew bolder after that night. They no longer lingered on the edges of our vision, content to watch. They moved closer, pressing against us like a living tide. They weren't whispering anymore either. Now they were screaming, not the kind of screaming you hear from a person in pain or terror. This was deeper, rawer, an endless howl that clawed at your soul, as though the universe itself was crying out in despair. It started subtly, a faint, mournful wail in the distance. But as we trudged through the wasteland that Earth had become, the sound grew louder, more insistent, until it became nearly impossible to think, let alone speak. We walked in silence, the oppressive noise grinding down what little resolve we had left. Fields led the way, his jaw clenched, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of hope. Kim stayed close to him, her hands trembling at her sides. I trailed behind, trying to ignore the faint translucence creeping up my arms. We didn't talk about it. The fading, the screaming, the way the sky flickered and warped like a glitching hologram. What was there to say? We were breaking apart, and then we saw it. On the third day after the encounter in the house, as the flickers reached a fever pitch, we stumbled upon what could only be described as a fracture. At first, it looked like a shimmering line in the air, barely visible against the distorted sky. But as we got closer, we realized it wasn't just a line, it was a tear, a jagged wound in reality itself, pulsing with an unnatural light that seemed to bend the air around it. It was massive, stretching from the ground to the sky, its edges crackling with an energy that made my skin crawl. The shadows were drawn to it, circling the fracture like moths to a flame. "This has to be it," Field said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the fracture. "The source of the breach. Or at least part of it," Kim added, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror. I nodded, though the sight of it filled me with a deep, primal dread. Whatever had caused this, it wasn't natural. It wasn't human. Field stepped forward cautiously, his movements deliberate. "We need to figure out how to close it." "How?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We don't even know what it is." "Doesn't matter," he said, his jaw tightening. "We don't have a choice." As we approached the fracture, the shadows shifted. They stopped circling and turned toward us, their forms solidifying into something more distinct. They were humanoid now, vaguely human shapes but stretched and distorted, their faces featureless, their movements jerky and unnatural, and they were blocking our path. Kim gasped, backing away. "They're not going to let us through." "We don't have time for this," Fields said, pulling the handgun from his holster. But before he could fire, one of the shadows stepped forward. It tilted its head, mimicking a human gesture, and then it spoke. "You don't belong here." Its voice was a chorus, layered and overlapping, like 100 people speaking in unison. "What do you mean?" Fields demanded, his grip on the gun tightening. The shadow didn't answer immediately. Instead, it reached out with one elongated arm, its hand dissolving into wisps of darkness as it pointed toward the fracture. "This world is no longer yours. Leave or face the consequences." "Leave?" Kim asked, her voice incredulous. "Leave to where? There's nowhere else to go." The shadow tilted its head again, as if considering her words. Then it stepped closer, its form shifting and flickering like static. "You brought this upon yourself," it said, its tone almost pitying. "The breach is your doing." "That's not true," I snapped, the frustration and fear boiling over. "We didn't cause this." The shadow paused, its head turning toward me. For a moment it seemed to study me, its featureless face tilting ever so slightly. "Not directly," it said, echoing the words of the figure from the house. Fields raised his gun. "Enough! If you're not going to help us, then get out of the way." The shadow didn't flinch. Instead, it stepped aside, its form dissolving into the air as it did. The other shadows followed suit, melting into the darkness around the fracture. We exchanged uneasy glances but didn't hesitate. This was our chance and we weren't about to waste it. As we stepped closer to the fracture, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground and into our bones. The air around it was thick, heavy, like walking through water. Fields reached out cautiously, his hand trembling as he touched the edge of the tear. The moment his fingers made contact, the fracture pulsed with a blinding light, and a surge of energy threw him backward. "Fields!" Kim screamed, rushing to his side. He groaned, sitting up slowly, his face pale. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his voice was weak. "But that thing, it's unstable. We can't just close it by force." "Then what do we do?" I asked, my mind racing. Kim looked at the fracture, her brow furrowed. Maybe it needs to be balanced. If it's a tear, then there has to be something holding it open. If we can disrupt that, then it might collapse on its own," Fields finished, nodding. The problem was, we had no idea what was holding it open. As we stood there, trying to make sense of the impossible, the shadows returned. But this time they weren't threatening. They were guiding. They surrounded us, their forms flickering and shifting. And then one of them stepped forward, pointing toward the fracture again. "Inside," it said, its voice softer now. "The answer lies inside." "Inside the fracture?" Kim asked, her voice trembling. The shadow nodded. "You'd think we'd hesitate, wouldn't you? That we'd stop and weigh the risks before stepping into a literal tear in reality. But there wasn't time for doubt. We didn't know what we'd find on the other side, but we knew one thing for certain. The fracture was the key to everything. If we wanted to fix what had been broken, we had to go through it. So we did. One by one, we stepped into the light, leaving the broken world of Earth behind. What we found on the other side, that's where the real nightmare began. Have you ever had one of those dreams where nothing makes sense, but deep down, that it's real? That's what it felt like. Stepping through that fracture wasn't like passing through a door. It was like falling into a dream that refused to follow the rules of reality. The first thing we noticed was the light. It wasn't sunlight. It wasn't moonlight. It wasn't any kind of light we'd ever seen. It pulsed and shimmered, changing color and intensity in ways that made my head spin. The ground beneath us was solid, but it didn't look like Earth. It was smooth like glass, but alive, glowing faintly as if it was breathing. And the sky? There wasn't one. Above us was a vast, endless void, black yet filled with swirling shapes and colors, like an infinite ocean of ink and fire. It was mesmerizing, terrifying, impossible. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was the silence. You'd think silence would be a relief after all the screaming shadows and the endless hum of the fracture. But this wasn't normal silence. This was the kind of silence that pressed down on you, heavy and suffocating, like it was trying to crush you from the inside out. We didn't speak at first. What could we say? Words felt meaningless in a place like this. But then something broke the silence. A sound, not loud, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the stillness like a blade. "They're here." I froze, my heart pounding. The voice wasn't familiar, but it wasn't entirely foreign either. It felt layered, like it was made up of fragments of voices I did recognize. Fields turned to me, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" I nodded. "Yeah, I heard it." Kim took a step closer to us, her eyes darting around. "What does it mean? Who's here?" Before we could answer, the ground beneath us began to shift. It wasn't violent, more like a ripple, as though the glassy surface was reacting to our presence. And then we saw them. Shapes began to emerge from the glowing ground, rising slowly like figures being carved out of light. They weren't shadows this time. They were something else. They looked human. Almost. Their bodies were made of the same shifting light as the ground, their forms translucent and flickering. But their faces were wrong. They didn't have features, just smooth, blank surfaces that seemed to ripple like water. And yet, as they turned toward us, I could feel their gaze. Cold, empty. "Who are you?" Fields demanded, his voice shaking. The figures didn't answer. They just stood there, staring at us with their featureless faces. And then one of them stepped forward. "We are the echoes," it said, its voice a perfect mimicry of the one we'd heard earlier. "Fragments of what was, remnants of what could have been." "What do you mean?" Kim asked, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, its form shimmering. "This is what remains. The breach shattered your world and ours. You opened the door, and now everything is broken." "Wait," I said, my chest tightening. "You're saying this isn't another world? This is a reflection," the figure finished, its tone calm but heavy with meaning. "A mirror of the collapse." I felt the blood drain from my face. A reflection. That's when I noticed something horrifying. The figures weren't just staring at us. They were mimicking us. Their movements, their postures, everything. It was subtle at first, but the longer we stood there, the more obvious it became. They weren't just echoes. They were us. Kim must have noticed it too, because she let out a shaky breath and took a step back. "This doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense." "You should not have returned," the figure said, its voice calm but unyielding. "Your presence disrupts the balance. The fracture cannot be undone as long as you remain." "Then tell us how to fix it," Fields snapped, his voice laced with desperation. "If we cause this, tell us how to stop it." The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it raised one hand, pointing toward the horizon. In the distance, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another fracture. This one was even bigger than the one we'd stepped through, stretching across the horizon like a jagged scar. But it wasn't just sitting there. It was a spreading. Cracks radiated out from it, snaking across the glowing ground, pulsing with a dark energy that made the air feel heavy and toxic. "If you wish to mend what has been broken," the figure said, its voice resonating in my skull, "you must reach the source." "The source?" I repeated, my throat dry. The figure nodded. "The heart of the fracture. But be warned, the void will not let you succeed." "The void?" Kim whispered. "You've already met it," the figure said, its form flickering. "It is the shadows, the silence, the nothingness that devours everything it touches." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The shadows weren't just monsters or remnants of the breach. They were the void itself, and it wasn't just consuming the earth, it was consuming everything. Fields clenched his fists, his face grim. "We don't have a choice. We have to do this." "Do you?" the figure asked, tilting its head. "You could leave. Walk away. Let the void take what remains and save yourselves." I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell the figure that leaving wasn't an option. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. We weren't heroes. We weren't saviors. We were just three broken people trying to survive. And yet, "We're not leaving," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. If this is our fault, then we have to fix it, whatever it takes. The figure seemed to study me for a moment, its form shimmering with an almost imperceptible glow. Then it stepped aside, gesturing toward the horizon. "Then go," it said. "But know this, once you reach the source, there will be no turning back." We didn't need to be told twice. We set off toward the massive fracture in the distance, the weight of the figure's warning heavy on our shoulders. As we walked, the glowing ground beneath us began to change. The light grew dimmer, the surface rougher, until it felt like we were walking on cracked glass. The void above us seemed to press closer, its swirling shapes becoming more chaotic, more menacing. And the silence? It wasn't silent anymore. The screams had returned, faint at first, but growing louder with every step we took. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. Because we knew, deep down, that the figure was right. Once we reached the source, there would be no turning back. And that terrified me more than anything else. The void was alive now. We could feel it in the way the air seemed to shift and pulse around us, like it was watching, waiting. Every step toward the massive fracture in the horizon felt heavier, like the ground itself was dragging us down. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. "Do you feel that?" Kim asked, her voice barely audible. I nodded, though I couldn't put the feeling into words. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something primal. The void wasn't just pressing against us, it was pulling us in, like a predator toying with its prey. Fields was silent, his focus locked on the fracture ahead. He'd taken the lead again, his determination like a shield against the suffocating dread. But even he couldn't hide the cracks. "I don't know if we're going to make it," I said finally, breaking the silence. Fields glanced back at me, his eyes hard. "We will." "How can you be so sure?" I pressed. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter, almost resigned. "Because we have to." It wasn't exactly reassuring. As we got closer to the fracture, the ground beneath us grew more unstable. The once smooth surface was now jagged and uneven, glowing faintly with that eerie light. Cracks spread out in all directions, pulsing with a dark energy that made my skin crawl. And the screaming was louder now, echoing in my skull like a living thing. It wasn't just noise, it was a presence, wrapping itself around my thoughts, digging into the deepest parts of my mind. Kim stumbled, her hands pressed to her temples. I can't take this. It's too much." Fields reached out, steadying her. "Keep going," he said firmly. "Don't listen to it." But it wasn't that simple. The screams weren't just noise. They were memories. Fractured, fragmented pieces of something familiar, like whispers from a dream I couldn't quite remember. And they were growing stronger. "Do you hear it?" Kim whispered, her voice trembling. It's voices. My mom, my sister, they're..." She trailed off, her eyes wide with fear. I knew what she meant. I was hearing them too. Not her family, but mine. Voices from my past, long buried but suddenly alive again, clawing their way to the surface. "I hear it," I admitted, my voice barely steady. Fields didn't say anything. He just kept moving, his shoulders tense. But I could see it in his eyes. He was hearing them too. The fracture loomed closer with every step, its jagged edges pulsing with a sickly, otherworldly light. It wasn't just a tear in reality anymore. It was something alive, something hungry, and it was waiting for us. When we were only a few hundred feet away, the ground beneath us began to shake. The cracks widened, spreading like veins, and the air grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. "We're almost there," Fields said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had before. But the void wasn't going to make it easy. The shadows returned, emerging from the cracks in the ground, their forms shifting and twisting like smoke caught in a storm. They surrounded us, cutting off our path, their featureless faces turned toward us in silent judgment. Kim backed away, her hands trembling. "What do we do?" Fields raised his gun, his jaw clenched. "We keep moving." But the shadows didn't attack. Instead, they began to speak. "You cannot undo what has been done," they said in unison, their voices a haunting chorus. "The void will consume all. It is inevitable." "We're not here to listen to your warnings," Fields snapped. We're here to fix this. The shadows shifted, their forms flickering like dying flames. There is nothing to fix. Only the void remains. That's not true, Kim shouted, her voice cracking. There has to be a way to stop this. The shadows were silent for a moment, their forms still. Then one of them stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. You seek the source, it said, its voice quieter now, almost sorrowful. But the source is not what you think. It will not save you. What is it then? I demanded, my fear giving way to anger. Tell us. The shadow tilted its head, its form flickering. The source is you. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. What does that mean? Kim asked, her voice shaking. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it pointed toward the fracture, its form dissolving into the air as it did. The answers lie within, it said, its voice fading, and then they were gone. The path to the fracture was clear, but their words lingered, heavy and suffocating. What did it mean? Kim whispered, her eyes wide. How can the source be us? I don't know, Fields said, his voice tight, but we're going to find out. We moved forward, the air growing colder with every step. The fracture towered above us now, its edges crackling with dark energy, the screaming so loud it felt like it was tearing my mind apart. When we reached the edge, Fields stopped, his hand hovering over the jagged surface. This is it, he said, his voice barely audible. Once we go in, there's no turning back, I finished, my heart pounding. We didn't hesitate. One by one, we stepped into the fracture, the world dissolving around us in a blinding surge of light. And what we found on the other side, it was us. Not reflections, not echoes, but us. We were standing in a void, an endless expanse of darkness punctuated by flashes of light. And in those flashes, we saw ourselves, moments from our past, our present, even glimpses of what could have been. It was overwhelming, disorienting. What is this? Kim whispered, her voice trembling. The source, a voice said, echoing through the void. We turned, and there it was. A figure stood before us, its form shifting and flickering like the shadows. But this one was different. It was made of light and darkness intertwined, its face an ever-changing mosaic of our own. It was all of us, and none of us. You are the breach, it said, its voice a perfect mirror of our own. Your return disrupted the balance, fractured what was whole. How do we fix it? Fields asked, his voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, its form rippling. You must choose. Choose what? I demanded. The figure didn't answer directly. Instead, it gestured, and the void around us began to shift. We saw Earth, not the empty wasteland we'd left behind, but the Earth we remembered. Lush, vibrant, alive. And then we saw the fracture spreading through it, tearing it apart, consuming everything in its path. You can close the breach, the figure said, but it will come at a cost. What cost? Kim asked, her voice trembling. The figure turned to her, its form shimmering. To mend what has been broken, you must return to the void. You must become the void. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. What does that mean? I asked, my chest tightening. The figure stepped closer, its face shifting to mirror mine. It means surrendering yourselves, sacrificing your existence to restore the balance. Silence fell over us, the weight of its words sinking in. Fields clenched his fists, his face pale. And if we don't? The figure turned toward the vision of Earth, now nearly consumed by the fracture. Then the void will spread. Everything will be devoured. There will be nothing left. It wasn't a choice, not really, but it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss and knowing there was no way back. Kim took a shaky breath, tears streaming down her face. I don't want to disappear, she whispered, but if it's the only way... Fields nodded, his jaw tight. We started this. We have to finish it. I looked at them, my heart breaking. This wasn't how it was supposed to end, but deep down, I knew there was no other way. We turned to the figure, our decision made, and together we stepped into the void. It was cold at first, a darkness so complete it felt like drowning. But as the light faded, as we dissolved into the emptiness, I felt something else. Peace. And then there was nothing. Nothing at all. But the story didn't end there. You'd think it would have, right? After all, how do you come back from dissolving into the void itself? But that's the thing about the void. It doesn't let go so easily. The first sensation I felt was a weightlessness, like I was floating in a bottomless ocean. It wasn't cold anymore. It wasn't warm either. It was nothing. But then slowly, something began to stir. A faint hum, barely audible at first, grew louder and louder until it was all I could hear. It wasn't a sound so much as a vibration, resonating deep within me, pulling me back from the brink of nothingness. And then, just like that, I was. Not fully, not in the way I'd been before, but enough to know that I existed, that some fragment of me had survived. I opened my eyes, or at least I thought I did, and saw a swirling expanse of light and darkness, an endless dance of chaos and order. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, like staring into the heart of the universe. And then I realized I wasn't alone. "Kim? Fields?" I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the void. "We're here," Kim's voice answered, faint but steady. "Barely," Fields added, his tone grim. I turned, or maybe I just willed myself to turn, since there was no sense of direction here, and saw them, their forms shimmering like mine. We weren't solid anymore. We were like ghosts, faint outlines of who we'd once been. What happened?" Kim asked, her voice trembling. "We became the void," Fields said, his expression unreadable. "No," a new voice interrupted, one that sent a chill through whatever was left of me. It was the figure from before, the one that had told us we were the source. But now it looked different. Its form was more defined, its features sharper. It was no longer a shifting mosaic of light and shadow. Now it looked human. "You are not the void," it said, stepping closer. "You are what remains of the fracture, the pieces that refuse to break." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice filled with frustration. "We sacrificed ourselves to fix this. Why are we still here?" The figure tilted its head, a faint smile playing at the edges of its lips. "Because the void is not so easily defeated. It is endless, eternal. Your sacrifice was not the end. It was only the beginning." "Beginning of what?" Fields demanded, his voice tight with anger. "The restoration," the figure said simply. Before we could ask what it meant, the void around us began to change. The swirling light and darkness coalesced, forming shapes, structures, fragments of a world that felt eerily familiar. And then I saw it. Earth. Not the desolate wasteland we'd left behind, but the Earth we remembered. Lush forests, rolling oceans, cities alive with light and movement. It was beautiful, perfect, like something out of a dream. But it wasn't real. I could feel it in my core, the same way you can tell when you're dreaming. It was a reflection, a mirage, a memory of what once was. "This isn't real," I said, my voice shaking. "No," the figure agreed, "but it could be." "How?" Kim asked, her eyes wide. "The fracture has been sealed," the figure explained, "but the void remains. It will always remain. Your task is to contain it, to hold it back, to ensure it does not spread again." "And if we fail?" Fields asked, his tone sharp. The figure's expression darkened. "Then everything will be consumed. This memory of Earth will be all that's left." The weight of its words hit me like a punch to the gut. We hadn't ended the nightmare. We'd only postponed it. "And what happens to us?" Kim asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure looked at her, its gaze unreadable. "You are no longer what you were. You are the guardians now, the barrier between the void and everything else. You exist to protect, to preserve, to ensure the balance is maintained." "Guardians?" Fields repeated, his voice bitter. "You make it sound like a choice. We didn't choose this." "No," the figure admitted, "but neither did the void." Its words hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the cosmic scale of what we were dealing with. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure gestured toward the vision of Earth. "You rebuild. You watch. And when the void stirs again, as it inevitably will, you fight." It didn't feel like much of an answer, But before we could protest, the figure began to fade, its form dissolving into the void. "Wait," I called out. "You can't just leave us like this." But it was already gone. We were alone again, floating in the strange liminal space between reality and the void. "What now?" Kim asked, her voice small and uncertain. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. For a while, we just stood there, staring at the vision of Earth, its beauty a painful reminder of what we'd lost and what we were fighting to protect. And then something shifted. The ground beneath our feet solidified, the void around us retreating as the vision of Earth grew sharper, more tangible. It wasn't real, not yet, but it was something. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt a flicker of hope. We weren't human anymore. We weren't alive anymore. But we were here. And as long as we were here, there was a chance to make things right, a chance to fight back, a chance to ensure that the void never won. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for. It wasn't the ending any of us had wanted. But the void didn't care about what we wanted. It started slowly, subtle at first, a faint ripple in the vision of Earth before us. The vibrant colors dulled, the edges blurred. For a moment, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of this strange, half-formed reality. But then I felt it, the pull. It wasn't physical, it was something deeper, something that reached into the core of what little remained of me. The void was stirring. "We don't have much time," Fields said, his voice low. Kim nodded, her face pale. "It's still here. It's always going to be here, isn't it?" "Yes," I said, the word heavy with understanding. We'd sealed the fracture, we'd become the guardians. But the void wasn't gone. It was only waiting, watching, looking for cracks in the fragile barrier we'd created. And as much as— "Then we stop it," Fields said firmly. "How?" Kim asked, panic creeping into her voice. "We don't even know what we are, let alone how to fight this thing." She wasn't wrong. We'd been thrust into this role without any guidance, without any understanding of the rules of this strange, in-between existence. But there was no time to figure it out. The ripple became a tear, a jagged crack spreading through the vision of Earth like a lightning bolt. Through it, the void bled in, dark and suffocating, its presence a physical weight pressing down on us. And then the screaming started, not the distant, fragmented cries we'd heard before. This was different, closer, louder. It was us. Our own voices, twisted and warped, echoing back at us from the void. It was a taunt, a cruel reminder of what we'd lost and what we stood to lose. "We can't let it break through," Fields said, stepping forward. "Wait," I said, grabbing his arm, or at least the ghostly impression of it. "We don't even know what we're dealing with. Rushing in isn't going to help." "Then what do you suggest?" Fields snapped, his frustration boiling over. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice shaking, "but there has to be a way to hold it back." Kim stared at the growing tear, her hands trembling. "It's trying to scare us. It wants us to panic." "She's right," I said, realization dawning. "The void feeds on fear, on chaos. That's how it grows." "So what? We just pretend we're not terrified?" Fields asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "No," I said, stepping toward the tear. "We face it." It sounded ridiculous, even to me. But something about it felt right. The void wanted us to crumble, to give in to the fear and uncertainty. But if we stood our ground, if we refused to let it consume us, maybe, just maybe, we could hold it back. Kim and Fields exchanged a look, their expressions grim. "This is insane," Fields muttered. "Probably," I admitted, "but what other choice do we have?" Together we approached the tear, the pull growing stronger with every step. The void surged against the barrier, a relentless tide of darkness, its screams deafening. I closed my eyes, or whatever the equivalent was in this strange half-formed state, and focused on the Earth we were fighting to protect. Not the empty, desolate wasteland we'd returned to, but the Earth as it had been, the Earth we remembered. I pictured its forests, its oceans, its cities. I thought about the people we'd left behind, the lives that had been erased by the void, and slowly the pull began to weaken. "It's working," Kim whispered, her voice filled with cautious hope. Fields closed his eyes too, his expression softening as he joined us in the memory. Together we focused on the Earth we loved, the Earth we wanted to save. The void pushed harder, its screams growing more desperate. But we didn't falter. We stood together, a fragile barrier against the endless tide. And then, something incredible happened. The tear began to close. The jagged edges of the fracture knit themselves back together, the void retreating as the barrier grew stronger. The vision of Earth sharpened, its colors vibrant and alive once more. We'd done it, for now. The void wasn't gone. It would never be gone. But we'd held it back. And as I looked at Kim and Fields, their ghostly forms shimmering with a faint light, I realized something else. We weren't just fragments. We weren't just echoes of what we'd once been. We were something new, something stronger. The void would return. We knew that, but so would we. Because as long as even a single fragment of us remained, there was hope. Hope for Earth, hope for the future. Hope that one day we'd find a way to end the void's reign for good. And until that day came, we would stand guard, forever.